Welcome to day 2 of our Space Shooter workshop. Today we're going to look and see how we can start adding color to our spacecraft. So this lesson is going to be heavily dependent on using Photoshop. So if you don't have access to that, there are other free programs out there like Krita or GIMP that can do the same thing. But unfortunately, the video does not provide coverage for those types of software. So having Photoshop would be the most optimal way to get through this lesson. And all the computers in the lab have Photoshop, so it shouldn't be too bad. All right, so I'm not going to posture too much. Why don't we just jump right into it? We're going to go into Photoshop. We're going to learn how to use layers. We're going to learn to use the clone brush. We're going to learn how we can use mask in Photoshop to help our textures out a little bit. We're going to learn how we can make transparency in our textures, so certain objects and textures on our ship textures are displayed correctly in our engine. We're going to see how we can import our color maps into our game engine, Unity. And we're going to see how we can assign our color map to our ships inside of Unity. So by the end of this video, you will have a .png color map for your ship. You will have imported your texture maps into the engine, and you'll tweak the pre-existing materials in Unity that help display our textures on our ships. We'll tweak it by importing and assigning our newly made texture maps to these materials, and we'll understand what materials are more when we get into that in Unity. So why don't we just go ahead and get to part 1. Alright, so what we're going to do is we're going to go to our Game Maker Space Shooter Assets folder. And you'll know this folder when you open it because we'll have our Unity folder and our texture folder. Today we're going to open up our Space Shooter texture files. And we'll see I already have some grunge maps and some trash and some grates that we can use to kind of add some spice to our texture map. So what we're going to do to open up our texture map is inside of our texture folder, we're going to double click on this PSD file. This is a Photoshop file. It contains layers and all the information we need and to create some nice textures pretty easily. So we're just going to let Photoshop open up for us. And when we open up our texture file, this is kind of what we get. Okay. So you see pretty much a black and white map right here. I'm going to go to the window and make sure my navigator window has a check on it right here. To make sure that I have this little tab on the right. This will allow us to be able to zoom in and out of our picture pretty easily. And when you zoom in enough, you can see that we can only see a portion of our texture file. And if you left click and drag this little red box up in our navigator window, we can zoop all around our texture file. This is a nice little tool to have to be able to navigate around our texture. And if we zoom in, we see just a bunch of randomly mishmashed geometric patterns. The way I decided to texture and create my spaceships in our game was to create just some generic textures and assign them to the models. So what you're seeing is a texture file that holds all the detail information for every single ship part in our scene and every single environment part in our scene. So I streamlined the process a little bit. So all we really have to do is make one texture color map and it'll apply to the whole game. And then in the future, we can see how we can tweak the same color map to add some differences between enemies, environment, and the player. But for right now, why don't we just focus on getting this map colorized and a little bit of detail added. So what we're going to do now is add a base color for our map because we don't want everything to be black and white in the scene, right? So this is what we're going to do. What we're going to do is we're going to go to Window and make sure Layers has a checkbox. All right. So I'm going to click it and click again to bring back my layers with a checkbox. You'll notice on the right hand side of our screen, we have a little window like this with layers, channels, paths, things of that nature. And what we have here is our layer box, our layer window. There are a few layers already made for us. Our main mask will help us create the nice kind of transparencies when we're done with our texture. Um, our occlusion is kind of the detail we see right now. I'll zoom out. So if I turn off my occlusion, then we don't get the black and white details. And we also have a layer for glows. I don't think we probably won't be able to, we probably won't use that. And then if we zoom down a little bit more, let's zoom in and see what this texture is. We have a little thing called a group in Photoshop, and we can collapse it and make it bigger. And then we just have layer 31 right here. This is just an extra layer that just happened to be in this file. And we're going to be able to use it to create our base color in a second. There's another thing we can use in our layers. Another helpful tool I was just talking about is being able to show and hide and lock and unlock our layers. So if I go to my occlusion layer, I'm just going to click on occlusion. We can see that it has an eyeball next to it, which means it's shown, visible. And we also have a lock on here, meaning we cannot edit this layer. So this is pretty important. I want to show you how we can lock and hide layers. For all intents and purposes, we're going to leave occlusion locked, so make sure you don't unlock it and leave it. But it's pretty easy. You see this little lock button? When we press it, we can lock and unlock layers pretty easily. Again, this is to make sure we can't edit it or make mistakes on it. When we're finished with a layer, we can lock it and say we're done. And then the eyeball next to it brings it back and hides it. So pretty easy stuff there. We can also adjust the opacity of layers. So I'm going to go to my occlusion layer right here, and I'm going to unlock it. That'll open up some of these options up here. I'm going to zoom in and show us the opacity section right here. The opacity is kind of like the strength or the transparency for whatever layer we have selected, in this case, occlusion. So if we click on the down arrow, we get this nice little slider. And you can barely see over here, I'll bring the zoom over a little bit, that if I do a 0 opacity, it's completely transparent / hidden. If I bring it to like 65, that means you can still kind of see some of the checkerboards behind it, but our details coming in. And just the more opacity we crank up, the less we can see behind it. You can still see a few checkerboards right here. But what we're going to do is we're going to leave occlusion at 100%. The opacity will come in handy when we mess with our base layer, base color layer in a second. So I'm going to zoom out and relock my occlusion layer with a lock. Next, we're going to need to talk about layer filters and how our layers blend with one another, because we have multiple layers in this layer window, don't we, down here on the bottom right. So if I unlock occlusion, I have this little drop-down menu, and right now occlusion is set to multiply. But if I select the menu, we have all these different filters that will basically be able to help us control how layers blend with one another. Do they completely override the layer below it? Do they lighten the layer below it? Do they just overlay on top of one another? Things of that nature. I'm not going to go show any examples right now, because you'll see the examples whenever we get to the actual work of creating our texture. I just wanted to introduce this menu because it'll be somewhat important in the coming techniques in this video. So we're actually, this time for real, going to add a color to our texture right here. So we're going to do in our layer box in the bottom right, I'm going to select this layer 31, and I'm going to single click or double click the name layer 31. I'm going to call this base color. So just double click names in our layers right here, and we can get into the renaming process. Next, I'm going to left click and drag and drop it right on to our texture folder. Now we have parented our base color. It kind of looks like what we were doing in our hierarchy inside of Unity, right? Just creating a nice organization within our software right here. So with base color selected, I'm going to click on it. It becomes highlighted. I now am going to pick a color that I like up here in my swatches tab. And you might see color, you might have like this color gauge thing right here. Swatches is pretty easy. And I'm going to pick a nice bluish green color. And with my nice blue color selected, I'm going to just make sure I have it again. There we go. You can see if I can go back between my color and swatches, you can see I have that nice blue selected right there. So what we're going to do is we're going to use a keyboard shortcut to fill this entire layer with this color. So what we're going to do is we're going to hold alternate, left alternate, and hit the backspace key. All right. That will flood your color with blue. Some of you, that might not work because maybe you have the second color selected right here. We zoom into my color. You might be on swatches. We zoom into color, and I have the second little white thing selected. All it's going to do is fill our texture with white. So make sure we have our first front little swatch selected with our nice color that we have selected. And the alternate and backspace button should fill our layer with all this color. So it's important to note that even though we just filled this entire thing with blue, we still see some of this detail from my occlusion layer right here. So if I lock and hide occlusion, that means it just goes away. We want to have this detail within our texture map. So make sure your occlusion stays on like so. So before we can start adding grunge to our texture, we have to kind of import our grunge files into Photoshop so we can get at them. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to my folder with all my texture maps here. And the easiest way to probably do this would be to select whatever grunge map you like. I like that rust. What I'm going to do is I'm going to drag and drop it. There's two ways to do this. I'm going to just drag and drop it right onto my texture. And then I'm going to hit enter. And there we go. I've dropped a grunge layer directly onto my texture. But this doesn't look very good, does it? We're going to see how we can tweak this grunge map now to make it work with our texture. Before we can start editing this grunge rust map that we have here, we have to do something called rasterizing the layer. And that's a kind of a technical term, but I'm not going to give it a different name so it's easy to understand. Rasterization is the process in which we can take textures and pixels and make sure that Photoshop can understand them so we can start editing. And you'll ask yourself, well, why didn't we need to rasterize any of these other layers? Well, you'll see this little icon right here. This little icon, I think more or less just kind of represents kind of a referenced or just a texture file that's kind of in here, but it's not all the way inside of Photoshop. So to get it all the way inside of Photoshop so we can edit it, we must kind of flatten it or rasterize it. So in my layer window right here, I'm going to select my rust layer, and it could be anywhere in your folder, in your layers right here. So just make sure you have it selected and highlighted. And then I'm going to go to layer up here in the top left, and I'm going to go to rasterize. And what are we going to rasterize? We're going to rasterize the layer. And now, if I zoom into this layer, that little thumbnail, little picture right there at the bottom right of my thumbnail is gone, and my rust pattern is all the way inside of Photoshop now. The next thing we're going to do is we're going to resize my rust texture right here. And we can do that by using our transform scale tool. So we're going to transform, and that's one way to do it. I think we're just going to use the free transform tool right here. Notice there's a tooltip, Control T. So we just went to edit, and we're going to go to free transform, Control T. And now we get this kind of outline around our box. And we can do a few things with this transform tool. I can click anywhere and move it. I can click the little squares on the outside so I can scale it any which way I want. And if we click outside of the outline rather than on the inside, I can rotate it. So to move it, click on the inside and drag. To scale it, click a box on the outline box, on this little outline wire. If you want to rotate, click outside of the outline wire, and you guys get it. So I'm going to kind of come in and make my rust a little bit smaller. And there we go. And I'm just going to kind of nestle it right up at the top of my map. The next thing I have to do to this grunge map is to set the layer filter so I can see some of this, excuse me, so I can see some of this previous detail that we see right here. Or we can just, why don't we do something first though? We're just going to have to organize this layer real quick. Why don't we drag and drop it and put it under our texture folder. Now we have a texture folder in our layers with our base color at the bottom and our grunge right above it. And we can already see that, our rust now has the occlusion detail, the black and white detail you saw earlier over it, but it's still kind of overpowering my base color. So what we're going to do, we're going to select my rust texture layer down here, and we're going to go up to my layer filter map right here. And why don't we just start with an overlay? So what did that do? Well, right there, now we can see that I still have kind of the splotchiness of my rust, but yet it's still kind of that bluish color that I really liked. And there are so many different ways we could add filters, darken. Here's multiply. Why don't we do like a hard light? So really, it's more about picking what kind of fits what you like to see. I like the overlay, so I'm going to stay with overlay. Next, I'm going to use my first brush tool, or rather my first tool inside of Unity, called the Clone Brush tool. So if we go all the way, let me bring over my texture to the center of the group. So if we go all the way over to the left over here, we see a bunch of tools and items. Well, right now, what we're going to use is this little stamp, clone stamp tool. And it's a little bit tricky to use, but if you follow along, it becomes pretty much second nature after a while. So with my clone stamp brush picked, I get this little circle on my screen, and I'm ready to start clone stamping. But before I can do that, we have to learn how we can change the size of my brush tip and maybe change its shape. So if we go up to the top left up here, you see this little fuzzy little circle right here? This is actually my brush setting for my clone tool. So if we click on the drop down menu, we can do a few things. I can pick a softer brush right here, and I can change the size of my brush. So at 12 pixels, you can see my circle over here to the right is pretty small. If I bring it up to 53 pixels, my brush has gotten a little bit bigger. So keep that in mind whenever you use your tool. So that's how we can adjust our brush size. The next part of using the clone brush is to pick the source in which we're going to copy from. So our clone brush basically takes maybe this part of the grunginess, and so we'll hold down the left Alt key, and you see how it becomes a crosshair? With my Alt key held, I'm going to left click. All right, I did it a few times. So now you can see that this type of the grunge right here, I'm able to paint it anywhere I want. And before we get painting, let's make sure we're on the right layer. All right, we want to be on our rust layer right here. So make sure you select your first grunge map that you brought in. I've used Alt and left click to pick a part of the grunge map that I want to start cloning or copying around. And look, I can start creating all this detail and transfer it down here just by left clicking. All right. So you'll notice one thing though. It looks pretty good. You may want to be tempted to fill it all in. But look what happens whenever I go too far. And I want you guys to notice my brush on the bottom of the texture is this big nice circle, and I'm creating all this grunge. But look up at the original grunge. You should see a crosshair floating around in the top left of my texture. That's basically what I am copying over. And look what happens when that crosshair passes over away from my original. Basically, I can't clone anything, and now we get just the same kind of square. So how do we make this more interesting? I just don't want to be painting down squares of grunge. what we can do is we can start selecting with Alt and left click, just random parts of these grunge textures. And I'm just Alt clicking at different spots on it. And I'm going to maybe start copying right here, doing it right there, copy right here, and then I'm going to go over it. So it's kind of like a rhythm here. It's almost like a rhythm game. You just do a little bit of grunging, pick a new target, paint, pick a new target, paint, pick a new target, paint over what you've already painted to even add more variation. And we're just using our clone brush to kind of give a nice splotchy grunge. And you don't even have to paint in the whole thing. Look how I've left some, just some blank spaces with my grunge. That'll leave a little bit more interest in it because it's, a little bit of variation. So I'm just going to keep grunging up my map here. Maybe even come here on all these small little details and just grunge it up. So that looks really good right now. Okay. Why don't we see how we can add another grunge map on here and have two grunge maps working with each other. So it's largely going to be the same process. Okay. So I'm going to go to my folder with all my different grunges. And this time I'm going to pick something that has maybe a little bit more detail. I'm going to use this kind of whole thing. And again, I'm going to left click and drag and drop it right on my texture. And here we have the same thing here. We have just a really solid folder, and we can drag it or drop it anywhere. And then I'm just going to kind of put it in the same place up here and press enter. And now we have a second grunge map in my scene. I was lucky enough in my layer window for the whole seamless to kind of already go ahead in my texture folder. But if you dropped it somewhere randomly in here, why don't we go ahead and just drag and drop it onto our texture folder. And then we have to rasterize this layer again. So with my new grunge layer selected, I'll go to Layer, Rasterize, Layer. And now my layer is ready to edit. Okay, so now that I can edit it, I can actually start to add a new filter for it because remember, we don't want my grunge map just to be there randomly. And if you want to move this around some more, here's our little move tool in the top left corner of our map right here, right above this little thing. This little arrow thing will allow us to move anything in our selected layer around. So we're going to make sure we have my second grunge layer selected down here in my layers right there. And now I'm going to pick a new kind of blend mode, soft light. And with my cursor, here's a little shortcut. With my cursor held over, I'm going to pick maybe lighten. And now with my cursor held over the lighten little drop down menu, I'm just going to mouse wheel up and down. Boom. Mouse wheel up and down. And I can kind of quickly see I like that darker color. Look how we can see some of those little rivets really just popping out here and there. And I'm actually going to go to my opacity right next to my darker color and bring it down to about 50, 60 or something like that. That way I can pick up, let me zoom in and see what we did. That way I can pick up some of the blue color underneath these little great details. All right, and it's just going to be the same thing. I'm going to now use my clone brush, and we're going to come over here to my little toolbar over here, and I'm going to go all the way down to pick this little stamp. So there was our move tool. I'm going to pick my stamp tool now. And it's basically the same thing. Again, I want to make sure that I've selected the second grunge layer. I don't want to accidentally be on this layer. I want to only be on this layer because I only want my cloned hull to be on this layer. So now I'm going to hold down the left Alt button and left click. And now I can start painting in this detail right here. And again, I'm just going to come in. And we're just going to retarget things and just generally kind of add in some detail real sporadically. We just want to create a nice splattering of just a little bit more detail. We really just don't want our texture just to be a solid blue with a few little shadowy detail, black and white things on it. We want to give this some interest. And you might be tempted to be like, well, how do I get a certain detail on my ship? Like I think I've seen this part of the texture on my wings. So I guess I could come in and really put like a sticker or something on there. Keep in mind that these textures are used throughout the whole game for every single thing you see. So even though your ship may have this, paneling texture right here, chances are your enemies and your environment will have it too. So the more specific you get with your textures, the more they're going to show up on your enemies and your environment. So if you have like, Earth Confederacy flag, coalition texture, whatever on here to show that your ship's part of the Earth fleet, well, guess what? There's a very real possibility that that'll show up on your enemy as well. So we kind of just want to stay away from specific details. We're just trying to give this texture file something a little bit more interesting to look at. Okay? And that's basically how we can use multiple grunge layers on top of one another using our filters like darker color or overlay to kind of combine one grunge map, two grunge maps, and a base color to create something that's a little bit more interesting to look at. You know, not bad for about 10 minutes worth of work, I would say. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and call my texture done. You are welcome to add as many grunge maps as you want. Just make sure you're staying on the right layer. Make sure you're rasterizing whenever you import that grunge. And make sure everything's organized within this texture map. So now that we got the kind of texture look that I wanted to achieve, we now have to prepare it to export into Unity. And there's a few things we have to do. The first step being is we got to add transparency back into my texture. And you'll understand what I'm saying. I'm going to go ahead and collapse my texture folder and hide it. And I want you guys to kind of look at what we were starting out with. You see a difference between the right side of my texture and the left side? What we're looking at is the left side of my texture is solid white with some detail. The right side has a checkerboard with some detail and some little icons on top of it. This checkerboard pattern means that inside of our game engine, it's not going to be drawn on our ships. So what I've done is I've created like all these different little hatches and vents and coils and whatnot, and I've made the surrounding texture on it transparent. That way I could go in and use these as almost like stamps on our ship to add a little bit more variation. So what we got to do is we got to make sure this checkerboard transparency, you know, follows with us all the way back into our game engine. Otherwise, the effect of my stamps with these hatches is not going to work too good. If that's a little confusing, just bear with me. It's definitely something we have to do right now, though. So I'm going to go ahead and zoom out here. And how can we get this transparency checkerboard pattern back onto our final color? All right. So what we're going to do is we're going to go up to my main mask layer. We really haven't talked about this guy up here in my layers window. And what my main mask does is if I go ahead and show it, look what it does. It goes ahead and says everything that I want drawn on my texture is going to be black. It's just like a mask that covers up everything that we want in our game. So everything that we want transparent, look, we can still see it's kind of blue and splotchy with some grunge. So we need to use this mask to basically delete everything that's not black right now, if that makes any sense. And you'll see the process and how it goes. So to select my mask, what I'm going to do is I'm going to hover over my little thumb icon for main mask. I'm going to hold down the control key, left control, and left click once. And what you'll see is you'll see all these marching ants around my shapes. And you'll basically see that it's kind of like a selection pattern on everything that is black. All right. So I'm going to zoom out. And now with this mask selected, I'm going to go ahead and hide the layer. Don't touch anything else in your scene. Don't click anything else. We want to make sure that these marching ants are marching around what we want to keep in our texture. All right. Now I'm going to come down to, all right, yeah, that's how we do it. All right. It seems that I lost. Okay, there's my mask again. Let's say, for instance, you do something and you lose your marching ants. Oh, they're gone. All you have to go back and do is remember just left click main mask and they're back. So what we're going to do now is we're going to inverse our selection because right now we have everything that we want in our texture map selected. If we inverse our selection, basically selecting everything we don't want, we'll be able to get that transparency back. So we're going to go to select, and we're going to go to an inverse selection. Didn't look like it did anything, but look what happens now when I select my base color layer and hit the delete key on the keyboard. Boom. We get rid of that blue and we see our checkerboard again. So basically with our inverse selection selected, I'm going to go to every single layer that I've made inside my texture folder and just hit the delete key. And boom, it's really just that easy. We used the mask, we inverted the selection, and then I went to every single layer and hit delete that I made. And look at that. We have the same kind of transparency in our texture folder or in our texture file. So the next thing we're going to do, now that I got my transparency built back into my texture file, very important to have those checkerboards just like this, guys. I'm going to go to File, Save As, and hopefully we're going to go back to the same folder all of our textures are in. If not, I'm going to go to the desktop where my assets folder is saved. I'm going to click on it. I'm going to go to the folder with my texture files, and you'll see where all the different little maps we had. Well, we only are seeing files of type .psd. So what we're going to do is we're going to go to Save as Type, click on it so we can get this drop-down menu to come down, and we're going to select PNG. Now you can see all the different PNGs I have. Next, we're going to call this Player Color, something like that, and we're going to hit Save. And it's going to ask us whatever. We're going to hit OK for the default options that come up here. And PNGs can take a few seconds to save, so just be patient. There we go. My little saving message is gone now up here. And now I should have a texture file. And I'm going to open up my same folder. Oh, there it is, playercolor.png. Knowing where you save this PNG will be very important when we want to import it back into Unity. So now that I know I have a good color map and I got it saved where I want it and named correctly, I can minimize Photoshop. We're not going to need it. And I'm going to go to Unity and open up my scene. You know what? I'm going to show us how we can open up Unity maybe the second time that we've ever used it by going to, our Unity icon on our computer, clicking on Unity, and then what you'll see is we have a launcher window. This is something new. Usually we were opening our scenes by going directly into the files, remember? We were going File, Unity Assets, Scenes, and then we're clicking Start Scene. We don't have to do that every single time. We can just click on our Unity button. We see this little menu right here, and the brilliant thing about it is if we've worked on our project before on this computer, we should see it saved right here. But let's pretend there's nothing right here, and we're going to open up our project by going to Open, and then I'm going to go to my desktop. I'm going to select my Game Maker Summer Workshop Space Assets folder, and then we can see my texture folder and my Unity project folder. I'm going to select my Unity project folder and select folder. And the Unity game engine will see that as where we were working earlier. And now we have this last scene that we had open, which was my player model scene. And look at that ship. It's really nice. And now we can kind of get in and start importing our color into our scene. So we're going to do a few things. The first thing we're going to do is we're going to drag and drop our player color right into my textures folder inside of my assets. So I'm going to click textures, and there's my textures folder. This was the original texture we were using. Look at this grayscale thing right here. So what we're going to do is we're going to, in my textures folder right here selected, I'm going to bring back my folder right here, and I'm just going to drag and drop player color. Just drag and drop it right there. And for the most part, default settings right here should be good, so we're not going to worry about that. So I've got the color imported, but my ship is still gray. How do I get this, my nice blue aqua grungy color map, onto my ship? Well, we have to do one more thing. We have to go to my materials folder right here, where it says materials, and see where it says player material. This sphere is actually what's being projected on my ship right here. So with my player material selected, my inspector changes to a material kind of fill. And you can see all the different maps we can have here. What we're going to change is our albedo map. Okay, that's where we want to put our player color. So I'm going to click, let me zoom in so we can see it a little bit more. I'm going to click on the little bullseye right next to albedo. Let me zoom out so we can see the map that comes up. And you'll see like a little map come in like this. There's tons of textures in my game right now. So you can either scroll for it and find it. Oh, there's my player color. Or you can just type in player, oh, there we go, player color. And boom, we'll double click on it. And now my ship is all grungy and blue and it's ready to start, I don't know, selling space spice on the trade market. I don't know, creating a little bit of lore. All right, so that's basically how we can get our color into Unity and applied to our ship. All right, so that is the basis of what we've been doing today. In the future, we'll use the same player color texture, or you can make a different grunge color for your enemies or environment. But maybe we won't have to. Look what happens if I just go into my albedo layer again in my player material. See player underscore mat. Look what happens if I click on the white and change the base color. I can start changing just the ship in general. So I can use one color map to change it to different colors because materials are awesome inside of Unity. And I want to show you what would have happened if we hadn't have added that transparency back to our texture. Remember the checkerboards right here inside of Photoshop? If we hadn't have done that step, you know what our ships would have looked like right now? That right there. You see these white things showing up. That's not good. But since we added checkerboards, we had something called an alpha channel, which is basically a transparency channel. And now we can just, and I don't want to choke it too much, just enough to get some of that detail away. So, you know what? I think I'm going to keep my ship green. Maybe a lighter green, just by tweaking the color map a little bit more. And that's what I want my player material to look like. All right, so thanks for watching. We covered a lot here. We've done some photoshopping, and we've got some new colors inside of our game. Thanks for watching.